Chapter 3. Blame it on Saucy Jack. As with most aspects of 19th-century life in Canada, the nation's newspapers had their deepest roots in England. Colonial standards of decency, content, and tone, as well as stylistic and marketing traditions, all hailed from the British media. On both sides of the Atlantic, Victorian mores demanded that all manner of social discourse adhere to quintessential English values: formality, decorum, modesty, and restraint. While the tabloids paid lip service to such ethos and aspired to civility, there was one realm in which public morality gave way to society's baser instincts: crime reporting. There, the public's thirst for the salacious details of the latest gruesome murder overrode all societal constraints. It was not always thus. From their very inception, newspapers were bastions of propriety and gentility, reflective pools of the tranquil, if somewhat narcissistic, society that created them. All the news that was fit to print tended toward the mundane: price lists, reports of past weather, with little effort to forecasting future conditions, shipping news, agricultural concerns, and just a smattering of polite local gossip. A subject as distasteful as death was confined to the obituaries, where the elite were venerated with the appropriate taste and hyperbole. The front pages were reserved for such fare as prolonged travelogues of foreign adventures or a rapturous audit of a society maven's spoon collection. Reportage and editorials were safe, dull, and as far removed from controversy as was humanly possible. All that changed on August 31, 1888, when, in a London slum known as Whitechapel, a thoroughly modern invention came into being: the serial killer. His name was Jack the Ripper. The Ripper saga began on Bucks Row in the heart of London's notorious East End. Long touted as a dumping ground for the country's huddled masses, Whitechapel had a well-earned reputation as a blight on the world's most cosmopolitan city. Overflowing with prostitutes, petty thieves, and destitute immigrants, murder was nothing new in Whitechapel. Yet even the most world-weary detectives were visibly shaken at the sight of the mutilated body of Mary Polly Nichols, a bargain basement hooker whose throat was slashed from ear to ear. Stripped of her tattered layers of clothing during her autopsy, the coroner uncovered deep stab wounds to her stomach and genitals, all rendered post-mortem. The macabre nature of the crime garnered some notice in the London tabloids, but it was not until the discovery of the second victim, Annie Chapman, another local prostitute, that the news media took notice. Chapman's body was found a half-mile from Bucks Row. Like Polly, her throat had been cut. This time the post-mortem mutilations were far more extensive. Annie had been disemboweled and her intestines tossed callously over her shoulder. Her reproductive organs had been removed with almost surgical precision and were not recovered at the scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner Dr. Bagster Phillips remarked, "Obviously, the work was that of an expert, or one, at least, who had some knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be enabled to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife." With a madman on the loose, the city's papers, highbrow and low, broadsheet and tabloid, abandoned all prior decorum. Many rushed to produce special editions that sold faster than the presses could churn them out. Newsagents employed street urchins to run through the cobbled avenues, their arms draped with the latest edition, shouting horrible murder. In Whitechapel police had few leads but an avalanche of suspects. No fewer than 18 men were named by the media, sparking hysteria and a wave of vigilante justice. Yet, for all the names carelessly bandied about, the unknown assailant remained just that, an unknown assailant, until September 28, 1888. On that morning, a plain white envelope addressed in red ink arrived at the offices of London's Central News Agency. The missive, purportedly written by the killer, was signed Jack the Ripper. The pithy moniker caught on and soon news organs across the globe dedicated front-page coverage to every flick of the Ripper's blade. 2 days later, Jack obliged their interest and struck again. This time, to taunt police and bait the media, he claimed 2 victims in a single evening. The first, Elizabeth Stride, was found just after midnight in a small courtyard off Burner Street. Her throat was slashed, but it seemed as though the killer had been interrupted before he could perform any of his trademark mutilations. Less than 1 hour later, a constable on routine patrol in Mitre Square came upon the second victim, Catherine Eddowes. She was gutted like a pig in the market, the officer told reporters, her entrails flung in a heap about her neck. In a final indignity, one of her kidneys had been removed. Just above the body, someone had scrawled a cryptic message: "The Juves, sick, are not the men that will be blamed for nothing." The self-anointed Ripper appeared to relish his newfound fame. As police combed the streets, he mailed another letter to the Central News Agency, boasting of Saucy Jack's work on a double event. The tabloids printed each sadistic letter verbatim, accompanied by graphic line art renderings of the victims and crime scenes. The lower the tabloid, the more tasteless the images. Many illustrators took considerable artistic license, depicting Jack as a top-hatted dandy who seduced his victims before dispatching them. The least reputable rags referred to the murders as the Romance of Whitechapel, equating the killings with the bodice-ripping seductions of the boudoir novels so popular among delicate Victorian ladies. The Ripper tale reached new levels of depravity when a third communique was sent to George Lusk, director of the newly formed Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The envelope bore the return address from hell and the package contained a small section of what later proved to be human kidney. The author claimed to have fried and ate the rest of it. The grisly tidbit arrived on October 16, sparking another media furor, but by Halloween, interest in the murders began to wane. With no arrests or further letters from the killer, public obsession with the case faded. Life in Whitechapel returned to its baseline to generate normalcy, but behind the scenes, Jack the Ripper was scripting his swan song. On the morning of November 9, an errand boy was sent to the home of Mary Kelly, a slattern who plied her wares from the bed in her squalid flat. The boy had been dispatched by the landlord to collect some long-overdue rent. Pushing open the front door, the lad stumbled upon what was left of Mary, ghoulishly arranged on the bed that had been her stock-in-trade. Her throat was cut as usual, but this time the wound ran so deep she was almost decapitated. The only victim killed indoors, Jack had made the most of the privacy afforded to create his masterpiece. He had flensed the skin from her forehead, nose, and ears. Her left arm dangled by a thin strip of flesh and both legs were flayed open from her thighs to her ankles. She was disemboweled and the killer had placed her hand inside her own gaping stomach, casually draping her liver across one of her legs. Her breasts, heart, and kidneys were dissected out and ghoulishly arranged on the nightstand. Strips of her flesh hung from nails once used for picture frames. Blood had been broadcast on every surface, a clear mockery of a priest wielding an aspergillum, dispensing holy water on the faithful. Most repugnant of all, Mary was 3 months pregnant when she died, and Jack had claimed her uterus and fetus as trophies. Police officers investigating Kelly's murder made ample use of the latest innovation in crime scene work, photography. The killing ground was captured in a series of starkly graphic images, copies of which somehow ended up in the hands of the local media, who plastered them across every newsstand in the country. Mary Kelly was the last of the Ripper's official victims. Some experts include the murders of 2 other prostitutes, Alice Mackenzie on July 17, 1889, and Frances Cole on February 13, 1891, in Jack's final tally. A merchant seaman, James Sadler, was arrested for Mackenzie's murder but never formally charged. He remains among the favored suspects of Ripperologists to this day. There is a fitting symmetry to the Ripper's involvement in the Annie Kempton story, even if he is only relegated to the cameo role of catalyst. For Saucy Jack remains the standard by which all killers are measured. There have been countless pretenders to the crown since, killers with higher body counts or greater savagery, but few have evaded capture as effectively or retained the stranglehold on our collective imaginations quite like the Ripper. Compared to Jack, Annie's killer was a rank amateur, yet, thanks to Jack, his single act of depravity garnered all the attention any criminal could want and no innocent man could survive. The legend of Jack the Ripper also gave birth to a new kind of journalism, graphic, provocative, titillating, vulgar, and speculative. It introduced the notion of murder as entertainment and marked the start of a bold new experiment that stretched the boundaries of what polite society would tolerate and even come to enjoy. The Ripper's arrival signaled a new wave in the Fourth Estate, a tectonic shift from nationally syndicated news agencies peddling innocuous human interest puff pieces to locally based news bureaus covering stories relevant to their own communities. As with all seismic fluctuations, the ripples forever altered the landscape of the Canadian press. Wire services were out and homespun stringers were the new world order. The local papers finally spoke in the voice of the people they served. A hierarchy soon developed in the media food chain. Tiny regional rags, unable to sustain a reporting staff, scavenged furtively on the questionable tripe of their larger, more evolved competitors, always putting their unique regional spin on the story. The legacy of Jack the Ripper lives to this day. If it bleeds, it leads. Murder sells newspapers, a sanguinary lesson writ worldwide in the wake of Saucy Jack's killing spree. The Ripper's fingerprints can be seen throughout the news coverage of Annie Kempton's murder. A brutal slaying was an oddly liberating act, at least as far as the Victorian media were concerned. Murder allowed even the most conservative paper to abandon its normal reserve and delve headfirst into a morbid world populated by the criminal element it once so studiously ignored. For at least one tabloid, such an abrupt deviation from standard operating procedure caused an internal conflict that spawned some truly schizophrenic reportage. In the haze of the Kempton murder and the gathering thunderhead of suspicion over Peter Wheeler, the editor of the Digby Weekly Courier laid bare his moral struggle for all to see. Criminal reporting is not in our line, and to kick a man when he is down is not our practice, but the most lenient and sympathetic of men cannot but recognize now in Wheeler a human sunk to the lowest level. Yet for all the feigned indignation at being forced to plumb such depths, the Courier was quick to draw parallels between Annie's murder and the antics of Jack the Ripper, lest any of its readers fail to make the connection. The details are sickening, even in the short mention we make herewith. It ranks with the worst of London slum scandals. The Courier's feeble protestations continued throughout its coverage of the murder and the subsequent trial, which, despite the editor's vehement objections, monopolized every issue for the next 9 months. Jack the Ripper was not the media's lone invention. If Saucy Jack represented a new breed of criminal, it was only a matter of time before a new species of law enforcement rose to combat him. It was no coincidence that the era of the Ripper was also the era of the super sleuths, eagle-eyed detectives capable of running their venomous arch-rivals to ground. Although entirely a figment of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fevered imagination, the fictional Sherlock Holmes exemplified this new genus of investigator, tenacious, brilliant, and genteel, the perfect foil for the newly mutated strain of miscreants and blackguards. Doyle's creation was all the rage thanks to a phenomenally successful serial in Strand magazine. For a populace besieged by crime at every turn, the allure of an infallible detective who solved every case was obvious. Holmes's popularity spawned countless knockoffs, including Agatha Christie's crack detectives Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, who collectively ushered in the golden age of detective fiction. Commerce abhors a vacuum, and the press is first and foremost a business. There was money to be made in murder, and ruffling the feathers of a few society dandies seemed a small price to pay for such bountiful riches. The London tabloids had inadvertently stumbled on a winning formula, one readily translated across the globe, and their Canadian counterparts wanted in on the action. England had the Ripper and Holmes, it now fell to the colonies to find their equal. The roles were already scripted, all the media needed were the right actors to fill them. With perfect dramatic timing, Annie's horrific death had given the maritime press their Ripper, all they lacked was their Holmes. On the picturesque peninsula island of Nova Scotia, in a country barely 2 decades old, a star sat waiting to be born. Life would imitate art in a way that left the local press breathless with admiration and scrambling for superlatives. For on that tiny spit of land lived a detective of legendary prowess, a worthy successor to Doyle's masterpiece. His name was Nicholas Power,